Hello and welcome to our final digital program of this season entitled Glorious Fanfare. We have a pretty eclectic program on the docket for you, with 4 out of the 5 pieces featuring principal musicians as soloists with the orchestra. The first piece on the program is written by a young woman by the name of Jocelyn Chambers, who, by the way, comes from my hometown of Austin, Texas. 2 years ago, she wrote this piece entitled A Study in Grieg as a part of her film scoring class at UCLA. The assignment was to write a piece of music in a particular composer's style with a romantic theme. And because she loves the Grieg piano concerto, she decided to choose Grieg as her model composer. It's a very short work written for the string orchestra, and I think you're really going to like it. The second piece on the program is written by the great Johann Sebastian Bach. It's his double concerto for violins and string orchestra. Our soloists are Callie Brennan, our interim concertmaster, and our principal second violinist, Haley Ju. I had an opportunity to speak with them about this piece and their relationship with Bach's double violin concerto, and here's a bit of that conversation. So let me ask each of you, you've played this piece several times, and I'm sure you've probably played the first part and the second part, and I'm sure you've also sat in the orchestra. So let me ask you first, Callie, how many times have you played the Bach double violin concerto?
I think I've probably played it about 5 or 6 times.
Both parts?
But yeah, both parts. I honestly can't remember which ones were which, but I do. The most recent time was about 4 years ago. So it's been a minute.
Yeah.
And I am honestly worried that I'll confuse the parts. Because
Right.
I have played both parts kind of equal amounts, I'm a little worried about that. So that I'm going to really concentrate on.
Yeah. And Haley, how many times have you played?
I have played around 10 times, I guess. I played a lot as a soloist, also as an orchestra musician. So I love this piece, especially the second movement.
Yeah, it's quite good.
Yeah.
It's a dialogue between the 2 instruments. So, I mean, the Baroque era is so string-centric. It's where so many advances came, and all of these fabulous makers of instruments came from that time. Why do you think, why is there this universality to Bach's solo string repertoire and measuring musicians? Why is Bach always on auditions? Why do we always ask to hear solo Bach from the string instruments?
I personally, if I can go ahead and answer that, I personally think that Bach is one of the composers that when you perform his works, you can't really hide your individuality, your character. It's so you can really get a view into the musicianship of the person that you're listening to, just with one piece. And it highlights so many difficult parts of playing an instrument. You've got intonation. You can't mess around with that. In Bach, it's so exposed. Interpretation, just your take on the piece. It's really telling of the person, whether behind the screen or that in the performance. So you can't hide.
Right. Haley, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the intonation part because, the Bach music is so based on the harmonic polyphony music, so you can't avoid going with the right intonation. So if you play out of tune, then it's so obvious. So it's like a no question there.
Yeah.
And also, I think there are so many rhythmic aspects in Bach's music, especially with the articulation combined. So for the audition, I think it's good to hear somebody plays with a good intonation, the good rhythm and sound quality as well. So there are so many aspects that you can find out with this person's Bach playing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The one's fundamentals are on display in Bach's music. Everything from intonation and rhythm, like you both mentioned, and the musical material itself is so, I guess, sort of sparse, it really shows, what the musician brings to the table in interpreting this fairly basic musical language of scales, arpeggios, and the stops and the double stops and all of the intonation issues with all of that stuff. So, in the middle of the 20th century, there was this whole movement, right, for historically informed music making, period ensembles and the period practice. And all of a sudden, we started seeing ensembles putting out recordings, playing the same instruments that were used in the Baroque era. And I'm just curious, do you guys have any experience playing the Baroque violin? Yeah, a ton?
I think, Haley, it sounds like you have a little bit more than I do. I have some from my undergrad, and you were in Germany, so why don't you tell us about that?
I think I played the Baroque violin for 2.5 years. So I had to carry the two violins in my case. So I needed the double violin case simply because of my Baroque violin. And it was, I think I was really lucky to have my teacher in Germany because she was also a Baroque violinist. She performed very actively at that time. So I have experience of playing the Baroque violin, and it's really challenging because there was no chin rest, no shoulder rest, and the bow was really short, and then I had to tune to very low the key, and then it was all very, very different.
So from an ergonomic standpoint, it's just very different. And then that shorter bow, you have to think about how many notes you can get in, versus what you are used to working with the modern instruments. So are you guys bringing any of the Baroque or period performance practice into your interpretation of the Bach double for this program?
Yeah.
Naturally, I think the piece really kind of calls for it, whether you mean to or not. If you have experience in early music playing, I think it just kind of comes out because the music really begs it. But also as a plan. Yeah.
Cool. So, what are some of the differences?
A lot in the bow stroke. Probably holding the bow up maybe a little bit higher. Right. Maybe. Exactly. Up on the stick a little bit more. Just using the bow differently. It's a lot lighter.
I think the most important thing for me is to adapt that transparent sound that we can make in the Baroque violin. So the string is also the gut string. Right. So you can provide really crystal clear articulation from the instrument and the bow. So I try to recall that articulation and the sound I used to play on the Baroque violin. Mm-hmm. And then it really helps me to bring out all these counterpoint and the fugue themes in the piece, so it doesn't sound really messy all the time. Right. Yeah. So I'm always remembering those sound from the Baroque violin.
Also, vibrato wasn't used hardly ever. It was seen more as an ornamentation, so probably vibrato would be a little less prominent.
Well, thank you both so much. I cannot wait to make music with you again and feature you both as our soloists for this fabulous work of later Bach, his double concerto for violins in D minor. So we'll see you soon, and be well and travel well, and can't wait to see you.
Likewise.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Also on the program is an interesting concerto for the viola and the double bass, written by the Austrian composer Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf. Now, Dittersdorf, you may not know, was a contemporary of Haydn and Mozart, and in fact, he played in a string quartet with Haydn, Mozart, and another famous composer of the day named Van Hall. I wish I could have been in the room when they were playing these quartets. I had an opportunity to speak with our soloists, Alvoy Bryan, our principal violist, and our principal bassist, Ian Brachida, about the Dittersdorf concerto. concerto for viola and double bass. You don't see that every day on the programs. We're really excited to be featuring you in this really charming piece of classical music. Let me get your impressions of this piece. Let's start with you, Alvoy. What do you think about the Dittersdorf Concerto for viola and double bass?
It sounds to me like a typical classical concerto. It definitely hears some elements of Mozart. I like the combination with the viola and the double bass, the middle voice, and the lower bass voice of the instrument family. So it's very, very typical, light eighth notes, some arpeggios. And the interesting is that the double bass is probably doing more work than the viola. So I'm more of accompanying the double bass. Maybe this is a joke, because if you would have paired a double bass with a violin, of course, the violinist would have won all the spotlight. So, the viola is kind of like the stepchild of the string family. So we know how to not be in the spotlight, and we know how to accompany, especially with chamber music. So I really like it. The middle voice, yes.
So Ian, what are your impressions of this piece?
Well, I agree with Alvoy. It's kind of high classical material, and the element that I like that Dittersdorf captures for me is that the movement that we're playing, at least, it's very conversational. The parts seem to have, he clearly was able to write a dialogue between the two voices, and Dittersdorf knew what the bass could do at that point, because he was friends with Haydn's bass player, who was kind of one of the virtuosi of that period. So he was aware of what was going on. But yeah, it gets a little active in that first movement. What Alvoy was saying. It's kind of, it's like the little engine that could back there, but.
And, just for all of the people that are curious about Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf, he was born Karl Ditters, and he was bestowed the nobility title by the emperor. So, of course, you have to add the von in there. And then I love how they just, riffed on his name, Karl Ditters from the land of Ditters, Ditters von Dittersdorf.
Alvoy and I, this is kind of fun, because I don't know if you guys know this, but Alvoy is quite an accomplished, aspiring electric bassist. And
I didn't know that.
We share a real love of that. We're both disciples of probably the father of modern electric bass playing, a guy named James Jamerson. Who was he was on a gazillion top 40 hits for Motown. And Jamerson was from South Carolina. Moved to Detroit to work with Motown. But backstage, when we were playing a lot in Greenville, we I don't know how we got onto it, but he was talking to me about bass, and I was talking to him, and he said, well, I've just got a rig and blah, blah, blah. So there's a mutual bass thing going on here. So
the cat's out of the bag. Yes. If you actually search the archive of Spartanburg Philharmonic, the first time I've ever played with Spartanburg Philharmonic was on a Pops concert, probably about, what do you want to say, about 5-6 years ago?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I played electric bass, and I remember when I showed up to rehearsal, I saw some of my colleagues from Greenville Symphony, they were looking like, Alvoy, what are you doing? Why do you have a bass, and why are you sitting over? I remember Angie, she came with, she was like, Alvoy, I just can't grasp, I can't wrap my head around it. I'm not ready to accept you.
I do remember this now.
Yeah, because you recommended me. I'm a secret bass player.
Nice. Well, so the Dittersdorf, I mean, concerto for viola and double bass, I don't know of another one. There might be some others, you know, the sort of like, you know, sort of anomaly pieces from the classical era where people were starting to write a lot for any virtuoso that they knew, essentially, you know. That's where we start to see the, you know, the development of wind concertos and the development of the wind instruments to be able to play, especially in the brass family, starting to play chromatically and stuff like that. You know, have you performed this Sinfonia Concertante before, ever?
I did not the whole thing. I was thinking about playing it, and I mean, God, we're going back a long time. And a pianist buddy of mine just, you know, I said, I'm going to just play the double bass part, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, so I've worked through it, but I had a buddy step in and play some of the viola part, but I have never performed it in concert. No.
Okay. How about you?
Supposedly we were going to do it at the governor's school a couple of years ago, and I don't know what happened, why we didn't do it. But it's kind of on the. There's all sorts of things here that are telling me that I need to be able to play this piece now, because I think it might come up down there too. So who knows?
Yeah.
No, I've never played it before. I've actually never heard of the piece before. So when I saw it was being programmed, I was like, oh, this is. And I'm always open. Chamber music is a passion of mine, and I've done different instrumentations, not your typical string quartets. I've done pieces for like viola and clarinet, pieces with I've done a piece in a chamber piece that featured an accordion. So I'm always open to do unusual pairings, but it's always great to play with great musician like Ian. So it makes it really easy to communicate.
Right. So let me ask just a couple questions about the actual instrument. So, you know, I don't have to tell you, there aren't nearly as many concertos, especially from this classical era, for the viola or the double bass. What about the actual instrument, you know, the sound projection issues versus violin and cello that are different from the viola and the double bass? And are there any things that you do, I guess, extra when you're in the soloist role differently than what you do when you're playing in the orchestra? Ian, why don't we start with you?
There's, as far as the sound issues with the double bass, with a lot of the technical innovations that have been made over the last 50 years, the advent of steel strings, the tailpiece wire on the instrument, different things like that. We've been able to really up the ante in terms of sound production, and, you know, just working that way in general, getting our technique to that point where we know that we can be heard. And therefore, you know, people are really, you know, they practice hard. And as far as stepping into you know, a solo seat, yeah, sure. I mean, you have to, your projection is different, you know, obviously a little bit more close to the bridge for a lot of that stuff, so that the sound gets out there. But it'll be, you know, it should be fine just by the fact that we're up front next to you. It's nice coming down front there and not having to push it from way back, you know, in the back of the house. But by the same token, it's also a little bit different too, because when you're usually, you know, most halls that I'm in, invariably I'm close to a wall, you know, and so you can kind of use the acoustics of that to help things along. Whereas this, you know, you're just in the middle and it's boom, you know, make it go out there. So
right.
Albert? You know, the thing about the viola, it really requires you to have a really good ear. I mean, almost like an audio engineer, and to make adjustments, you almost have to ignore the dynamics. And you have to have a good understanding of what you hear and projecting and understanding the harmonic importance of your part. Because most of the time the viola part does not get the melody. We're playing the accompaniment part. We're playing, you know, the chords, and a lot of times we're playing like the thirds of the chord, which shapes and define the chord. So knowing what chord member you're playing, you really have to have a really good understanding of harmony to be a violist. And also, as far as projection, which is, like I said, it can be an issue on the viola, especially going between the D string and the G string. It's kind of, if you think of it vocally, going between like the chest voice and the head voice. So you really have to be particular about what fingers you're going to use or what strings you're going to play on, depending on the dynamic, depending on the type of sound that you want. So you really have to know the technical parameters around your instrument on how to generate, sound. Do I want a brighter sound? Okay, I'm going to use an open string. Okay, if I have a scale run that goes between the D and the A string, but I don't want the tone quality to change, I might play it in second position to, keep to balance off. So you have to understand your instrument too, how bright and how dark some of the notes are based on some of the strings. But one important thing is you have to have an excellent bow arm. You really need a lot of arm weight to pull the sound out of the instrument. Unlike the violin and the cello, those, it's almost cheating on those instruments because they just respond immediately when you play them. And I can say that, I can say that because I play the violin too. So it's, and so it instantly responds. You play it, you don't really have to have a good bow arm. And yes, I said that to play the violin or the cello, the instruments, they have forgivable, but the viola is unforgivable. So you really have to work on, and even with my private students, the first thing I work on is sound projection.
Can't wait to feature you guys on this program with the Dittersdorf Sinfonia Concertante for viola and double bass in D major. But what a perfect program to do it on, this program that features not only the two of you, but Callie Brennan, our concertmaster, Haley Jew, our principal second violinist, and of course Brennan Shaffron playing the Poulenc organ concerto, and Brianna Tam in Peter's new piece for electric cello, timpani, and strings. It's going to be a really great program. Thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today, and I can't wait to make music with you again.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited. Definitely looking forward to the performance.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Thanks, guys. It's always exciting when the Philharmonic premieres a brand new piece of music, especially when it's written by our composer in residence, Dr. Peter B. Kay. Peter wrote a concerto for electric cello with an accompaniment of timpani and string orchestra. Our soloist is Brianna Tam, our principal cellist, and I had an opportunity to speak with Brianna and Peter about this brand new piece entitled Descent, in honor of the late Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Cool. Well, we're really excited for our next program. Obviously, we can't wait to make music again and premiere this fabulous new piece by you, Peter. Tell us a little bit about your new work.
Sure. So first of all, I've never written for electric cello and string orchestra before. So this is really new for me. A few months ago when Stefan, you and I were talking about changes for this spring, because we knew we were going to have to, be safe during the pandemic, and we were looking at new works. You had said, hey, do you want to write something for cello? Because we already had the two violin features and we were looking at bringing back the Poulenc. So I said, yeah, absolutely. And I would for electric cello because we know that Brianna plays that. So, I jumped at the chance to do that. So I'm really excited to write for the electric cello. And really, there was this idea already kind of floating around in my mind back in September when we did our Ludwig concert. I was backstage and the two of you were on stage performing. And actually, we were in the funeral march from the Eroica, Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. And my phone lit up with the news that RBG had passed away, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But she was an important figure in our culture, and at that time, and there we were, in a whole new world, doing a digital concert, which we've never done before. There was no audience. It was surreal. We'd been working so hard to get to that point, and Beethoven's music, and then this moment, and it really moved me. And so I wanted to write something about that in a sense. Really what ended up happening was that was a starting point from which this piece was born. And looking back, if listening to this piece, if I hadn't told you any of that, you might not say, "Oh, that reminds me of Supreme Court Justice RBG." Like it's not related in that sense, Yeah, right. This sounds a lot like her. No, it's where I started with this piece, and I was listening to the Eroica and studying that. But as with any musical study and programming, and this, Stefan, when you're building a program, you'll start in one place and you might end up way far away. And I kind of feel like that's where this went. I tried to keep it tied to the original ideas, and certainly it has this sentiment there, but it's not a funeral march by any means. And it's not a remake of the Beethoven. I don't really quote Beethoven, although there are some snippets that come from his symphonies, his ideas, for sure. I definitely used Beethoven as a role model for this. But again, it's also infused with popular culture. It's got, the nickname RBG is taken from Notorious RBG was taken from Notorious B.I.G., which is a pop star. So, that's kind of what I was going for with some of the musical themes here, was that it's a combination. She loved opera. She played the cello RBG, and she was also Notorious RBG. So I kind of wanted to bring those two ideas together in this piece.
Very cool. So Brianna, has anyone ever written an electric cello concerto for you in mind?
No.
First, huh?
Definitely a first, yeah.
So now that you've gotten the music, and I know you and Peter have been communicating, what are your impressions of the work so far?
I think it's really awesome. I've actually never seen a piece with loop pedal for orchestra, so I'm really curious to see how that works out. But I think the effects will be really cool, and I don't think there's anything quite like it out there yet, so I'm really excited to perform it and share it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of incorporating, obviously, the amplified and oftentimes, manipulated sound of the electric cello with distortion or no distortion or different types of sound effects will be interesting to, sort of experiment with for you. And then, how do we balance all of that in the hall? Because you're going to be the only amplified, instrument on the stage, and it's just the strings and the timpani. It'll be interesting how all of that kind of fits together. It's always interesting when you add amplification to the mix. So you mentioned the loop pedal and this idea of looping. Could you explain for those of us out there that don't know exactly what that means, what the loop pedal does and what looping is?
Yeah, so it's there's a couple different versions, obviously, but it's basically a device where you press a button, you play, you press the button again, and then it plays back exactly what you just played. And so that gives you opportunities to create a lot of different layers. And now the one I have has 3 separate sets of pedals. So I can set up 3 different things going on. Like maybe one has a bass end, maybe one has like a treble, higher end, maybe one's percussive. And I can cut one out whenever I want to. So you can have a lot of control over the layers that you set up. So.
Cool. So you can play, like you can be your own ensemble.
Yeah, essentially.
Awesome. So, in looking at the piece, I definitely see the connection to Beethoven musically speaking, just from the first timpani notes, right? I mean, it's like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
A little bit of the ninth in there. But Peter, you also talked a little bit about in your program notes how in the second movement of the Eroica, the funeral march, he has this contrary motion in the high voices and the low voices, and it seems like whenever they go up, the basses go down and vice versa, this sort of contrary motion. And in looking at the piece, I noticed that all over the place, and it's really cool how you've incorporated that in there. So Brianna, I mean, how did you get into electric cello? Is this something that you've been doing for a long time, or is this like you just kind of picked it up and started running with it, or?
So there's like two parts to the story. So the first part is I've always wanted to kind of create my own one-person orchestra, because when I played chamber music, I always memorized everybody's part, and I like really wanted to play all the parts together at once. But obviously you can't do that. So I felt like when I discovered the loop pedal, which is part of my electric cello setup, it gave me an opportunity to become my own orchestra or my own quartet or whatever I wanted to do. And that's something I dreamt of for a very long time. The second part is I never grew up with a lot of like rock and roll or a lot of popular music. Like it just wasn't played in my household. And then when I was like, I think 13 or 14, I found Guitar Hero, the video game. And it opened my ears and my eyes up to a lot of music that I hadn't heard like ever before. Like, and one in particular was Muse, Nights to Sidonia, which is like towards the end of the game. It's like kind of a rock and roll song, but the guy's classically trained, so it's kind of, you know, more complicated in terms of the composition. Yeah. And that song just kind of changed my world. I was like, wow, I wish I could play something like this on cello, but, you know, I'm always playing classical and, you know, I want to just do something a little different. And then I looked up rock and roll cello and I came across Tina Guo, who's like the famous electric cellist. Right. When I was like 13, 14, I was like, I really want to do that. Like, that's what I want to do. Not to be like a sellout or to just do pop covers, but more like just to have a different flavor and play different music. Because to me, music is music. If it sounds good, it sounds good. I don't care if it's classical, if it's rock and roll, whatever. So I just want to have an instrument to create different sounds and different genres with. So
very cool. Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, have you ever sat down with a Mozart or a Beethoven string quartet and tried to play all the parts on your electric cellos?
I've done Beethoven, the Seventh Symphony, the slower movement.
Yeah.
So,
cool. That's perfect. Yeah.
Very cool.
That was kind of looped, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Beethoven, you know, he in his middle period, he sort of had a little minimalist thing going on, you know, in the Sixth Symphony and in the Seventh Symphony, for sure. So, Brianna, you also have your first solo album, electric cello solo album, coming out. Can't wait to hear it. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how to get it?
Yeah, so it was actually about a year ago. I went through kind of a difficult time in my life, and it was kind of a point where I had to decide if I was going to, you know, kind of stay kind of an adolescent or mature into an adult, and I chose to mature and to pick a more difficult route. So the album is based on that journey. It's based on the before and the after. And it also incorporates the musical aspect because the electric cello thing is kind of a little newer. So those are tied together. It can be found Spotify, iTunes, Bandcamp. I also have my website, it's just briannatam.com. So
awesome. And what's the name of the new album? Growth.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, everybody look out for Brianna's new album entitled Growth that you can find pretty much everywhere. Just Google it and you'll be able to enjoy her. Awesome. And a lot of it has your own compositions as well, right?
Entirely. Yeah.
It's entirely your own music.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, maybe you can write your own electric cello concertos.
Oh.
I cannot wait to perform this brand new work with you, Brianna, and the orchestra. And Peter, thank you so much for writing this wonderful addition to the repertoire. I think it's so cool how you have brought in the idea of heroism in this piece from, you know, a musical hero like Beethoven to a political and social hero like RBG, who meant so much to so many people. And I think your new work entitled Descent is going to be just very well received. And hopefully, Brianna, this is the first of many electric cello concertos written for you. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much, and look forward to making music with you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. The final work on our program is the Organ Concerto by the French composer Francis Poulenc. Now, Poulenc is known for his somewhat spirited and sometimes irreverent music, but this organ concerto is quite different. In 1936, a dear friend of his passed away, and it inspired in him the need to reconnect with his Catholic faith. And this organ concerto has a sort of religious tone about it. It's a very interesting work, and it was written for a somewhat small venue, which must be why the accompaniment is just for strings and timpani. I guess Poulenc knew that the organ was going to be able to create all of the colors that a wind and brass section could do, so the organ would be able to take care of all of that. Now, this piece is in 7 movements, but it's all together, so you'll hear very distinct sections in the piece. Let's watch Brennan take us through the different sections and themes of this piece at the organ.
Welcome to the Episcopal Church of the Advent in Spartanburg. Poulenc's concerto is scored for organ, strings, and timpani, and it was written shortly after he converted to Roman Catholicism. It has a very foreboding opening, and it sounds like this. After a big outburst from the organ, we get to hear the first fast section. I'm going to play what the orchestra plays on one keyboard, and I'm going to play what the organist plays on another keyboard. The orchestra states the first fast theme, and the organ answers it. This goes on for a while, and all of a sudden, we hear a new theme, which, for lack of a better word, could be called the happy theme. And that goes like this. After a long, loud chord from the organ, we get a new section, which would be the second slow section. It's mostly played by the organist, so what you hear right now would be almost exactly as it would sound if we had the strings and the timpani with us. And then it grows in volume, and we get to the second fast section. It continues with those fast notes for a decent while, and it grows in intensity until we get the second slow section, and this could be called the religious section. It's really contemplative, really inward, and most importantly, really beautiful. And continuing in that vein, we have the final fast section of the piece. Then it comes to a grinding halt, and we hear the following, just like we would have heard it at the beginning. We hear some very tender writing for the strings and organ. The organ plays some really low notes during that section, and so it's almost like you can feel the hall vibrating a little bit. You feel a little bit of a rumbling at your feet. That's one of the wonderful things about the Twitchell organ. It's low sounds, both low and soft and low and loud. And this is how the piece ends.
I hope you've enjoyed learning about this program, and be sure to tune in on March 20th for the airing of Glorious Fanfare.